Before we begin, I have a question for you. Do you think that a single diplomatic event can really be enough to trigger an entire war? Write your opinion in the comments below. I'm curious to see how you see it. The Franco-German War of 1870 is one of the most decisive moments in European history. Within a few months, the continent's power structure was completely reorganized, and the effects of this conflict are still felt today. It is about political intrigue, strategic decisions, national interests, and personal ambitions, which together triggered a chain of events that no one could stop. In this video, we take you on a journey to a time when Europe was on the brink of great change. You'll see tensions between nations grow, words turn into weapons, and a war emerges that shapes not just two countries, but the future of an entire continent. If such stories fascinate you and you want to learn more about the background of historical events, then support the channel with a like and subscribe to it so that you don't miss anything. And now let's dive into the events that changed Europe forever. Chapter 1: Europe before the storm. Europe in the 19th century was a continent in transition, marked by old monarchies, new ideas, and growing tensions that slowly but inexorably escalated. To understand the events of the Franco-German War of 1870, one must first take a look at the decades that preceded it, a time when the balance of power, while seemingly stable, was already beginning to crumble beneath the surface. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Europe was reorganized. The great powers, including Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, and also France, tried to create a system that would prevent future major wars. This so-called balance of power was intended to ensure that no nation became too powerful. But this balance was fragile, because it was based less on trust than on mistrust and mutual control. The situation was particularly complicated in the area of today's Germany. Instead of a united nation-state, there was the so-called German Confederation, a loose association of over 30 sovereign principalities and kingdoms, dominated by the two great powers Austria and Prussia. These two rivals did not fight each other openly, but their competition for influence within the Confederation was omnipresent. While Austria was considered the traditional leader of the German states, Prussia began to gain increasing strength in the course of the 19th century, economically, militarily, and politically. At the same time, a new powerful idea was spreading: nationalism. More and more people began to see themselves not only as subjects of a prince, but as part of a nation with a common language, culture, and history. This development called the existing order into question. In many regions of Europe, not only in Germany, but also in Italy and other parts of the continent, the desire for national unity grew. These tensions were first clearly discharged in the revolutions of 1848. In numerous European cities, people took to the streets to demand political participation, national unity, and more freedom. There were also uprisings and assemblies in the German states, for example in Frankfurt's Paulskirche, where an all-German parliament met. But this movement ultimately failed, mainly due to resistance from the princes and internal conflicts. Hopes for a united, democratic Germany were initially dashed. Despite this setback, the ideas of unity and nation did not disappear. On the contrary, they were increasingly taken up by the existing powers and used for their own purposes. In Prussia in particular, it was recognized that national unification could not necessarily be achieved through revolution, but also from above, through clever politics and military strength. Meanwhile, France pursued its own interests. Under the leadership of Napoleon III, who had ruled as emperor since 1852, the country tried to maintain its position as a great power. France was proud of its military tradition and its cultural importance in Europe. At the same time, however, the developments in the German states were viewed with growing concern, especially the rise of Prussia. A united Germany under Prussian leadership would significantly change Europe's balance of power and weaken France's influence. Economically, too, Europe was in a phase of profound change. Industrialization spread, railways connected cities and regions, and new technologies changed production and everyday life. Prussia benefited particularly strongly from this development. The so-called Zollverein, an economic union of German states under Prussian leadership, promoted trade and economic growth. As a result, Prussia not only gained prosperity, but also political influence. Prussia's military strength was another decisive factor. Through reforms in the army, modern weapons, and an efficient organization, the Prussian army became one of the most powerful armed forces in Europe. This military superiority was to play a central role in the coming years. But despite all these developments, Europe officially remained at peace. The great powers were aware of the destructive power of war and sought to resolve conflicts diplomatically. At the same time, however, mistrust grew. Alliances were forged, plans were made, and strategies were developed, often in secret. The situation between France and Prussia in particular became increasingly acute. Both states watched each other closely, looked for advantages, and tried to strengthen their position. France wanted to prevent Prussia from becoming too powerful, while Prussia wanted to further expand its role as the leading German power. In this tense atmosphere, Europe was like a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest fuse. It only took a trigger to turn the pent-up tensions into open conflict. And exactly this moment was to come soon. The coming chapters will show how diplomatic tensions turned into war, how decisions made by individual men influenced the course of history, and how a conflict arose that would change Europe forever. Chapter 2: The Path to German Unity. While Europe was characterized by a fragile equilibrium on the outside, a development began to emerge within the German states that was to fundamentally change this balance. The path to German unity was not a straightforward process, but an interplay of political decisions, military conflicts, and strategic calculations, driven above all by one man, Otto von Bismarck. When Bismarck was appointed Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862, the country was in a political crisis. The Prussian King Wilhelm I wanted to reform and strengthen the military, but the parliament refused to approve the necessary funds. It was in this tense situation that Bismarck came on the scene, a man who did not believe in parliamentary compromises, but in power politics. In his famous Blood and Iron speech, he made it clear that the big questions of the time would not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by military strength. Bismarck's goal was clear: the unification of the German states under Prussian leadership, without Austria. This concept, often referred to as the Kleine Deutsche Lösung, represented a radical break with the previous order. Austria, which had played a dominant role in the German Confederation for centuries, was deliberately excluded. In order to achieve this goal, however, Bismarck first had to rearrange the balance of power within Germany. The first step on this path was the conflict with Denmark in 1864. The focus was on the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, which were shaped by both German and Danish interests. When Denmark tried to bind Schleswig more closely to itself, the German states were forced to act. Prussia and Austria waged war together against Denmark, a rare moment of cooperation between the two rivals. The war was swift and successful. Denmark was defeated, and the two duchies were placed under Prussian-Austrian administration. But this is exactly where Bismarck's strategy came in. The joint administration was to lead to tensions in the long term, and that is exactly what happened. Different ideas about how Schleswig and Holstein should be governed led to growing conflict between Prussia and Austria. Bismarck deliberately used these tensions to bring about a war with Austria. In 1866, the time had finally come. The so-called German War began. Prussia competed against Austria and its allies, including several southern German states. But unlike previous conflicts, this war was short and decisive. The Prussian army, modernly equipped and efficiently organized, was able to quickly prove its superiority. The decisive battle took place at Königgrätz. Within a few hours, the Austrian army was defeated, an event that permanently changed the political map of Europe. Austria had to withdraw from German affairs, and the German Confederation was dissolved. It was replaced by the North German Confederation, an association of the North German states under the leadership of Prussia. This new alliance was more than just a military alliance. It had a constitution, a common parliament, and a unified foreign policy. Prussia had thus taken a decisive step towards German unity, at least in the north. But the South was initially left out. States such as Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden were closely linked to Prussia, but wanted to preserve their independence. Bismarck knew that a complete unity of Germany was only possible if these southern German states were also integrated. But he also knew that this could not be achieved through diplomacy alone. It needed an external enemy, a common enemy who would weld the German states together. At the same time, the perception of Prussia in Europe also changed. The quick victory over Austria had shown that a new power had emerged on the continent. In France in particular, this development was observed with growing concern. A strong united Germany under Prussian leadership posed a direct threat to the balance of Europe, and to its own position as a great power. But Bismarck proceeded cautiously. He knew that too early or ill-considered action could turn other powers against Prussia. Therefore, he diplomatically isolated Austria, secured Russia's neutrality, and also kept Great Britain out of the conflicts. His politics were characterized by a keen sense of timing and power relations. Meanwhile, in the interior of Germany, national consciousness continued to grow. Prussia's successes strengthened confidence in a possible unity. Many people began to see themselves not only as Bavarians, Saxons, or Prussians, but as Germans. Newspapers, associations, and political movements helped to spread this idea. The German states also moved closer together economically. The Zollverein, which had already been established under Prussian leadership, now included more and more areas. Common markets, uniform weights and measures, as well as the expansion of the railway networks promoted exchange and integration. Economic unity preceded political unity, so to speak. Nevertheless, the situation remained tense. The southern German states were skeptical about full integration into a Prussian-dominated state. At the same time, France was not prepared to accept Prussia's growing power without doing anything. It was only a matter of time before these tensions would erupt. Bismarck was aware of this, and ready to seize this moment. It was clear to him that German unity would not be achieved through negotiations alone. It would arise in the shadow of a conflict that would weld the nation together and overcome the last resistance. Thus, at the end of the 1860s, Europe was once again at a turning point. Prussia had consolidated its position, Austria was forced out of the game, and the idea of a united Germany was more tangible than ever. But at the same time, the danger of a major war grew, a war that would decide not only the future of Germany, but the entire power structure of Europe. The stage was set. The actors were ready. And everything indicated that the next conflict would not be long in coming. Chapter 3: France under pressure. While a new power was forming in Eastern Europe with the rise of Prussia, France came under increasing political and social pressure. The country, which had determined the fate of Europe only a few decades earlier under Napoleon Bonaparte, was now confronted with a changed reality. At the center of this development was Emperor Napoleon III, a ruler whose policies fluctuated between ambition, insecurity, and growing isolation. When Napoleon III proclaimed the Second Empire in 1852, many French people associated him with the hope of stability, economic progress, and national greatness. In fact, France experienced a period of modernization in the years that followed. Under the leadership of Baron Haussmann, Paris was fundamentally transformed, industry grew, and the railway network was expanded. To the outside world, France presented itself as a modern, strong nation. But behind this facade, cracks were increasingly appearing. The domestic political situation was tense. Although Napoleon III had secured his power through authoritarian measures, pressure from liberal and republican forces grew over time. They demanded more co-determination, a stronger role for parliament, and an end to political repression. In order to meet these demands, the emperor introduced gradual reforms that were intended to liberalize the system, but this opening also brought with it new uncertainties. At the same time, France suffered from foreign policy setbacks. The attempt to establish an empire in Mexico under French influence ended in disaster. Emperor Maximilian, appointed by Napoleon III, was executed in 1867 and France was forced to retreat, a major blow to the country's international reputation. In Europe, too, France was increasingly less successful in asserting its interests. The developments in the German states were particularly worrying for the French leadership. The rapid rise of Prussia under Otto von Bismarck posed a direct challenge. France had long seen itself as the leading power on the European continent, but now a potential rival emerged in the East that was militarily strong, politically skillful, and economically dynamic. The victories of Prussia in the wars against Denmark and Austria were followed with great attention in Paris. Above all, the victory over Austria in 1866 had far-reaching consequences. With the founding of the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership, it became clear that German unification was no longer a distant vision, but a real possibility. For France, this meant a strategic threat. A united Germany on its eastern border would fundamentally change the balance of power in Europe. Napoleon III tried to react to this development, but his policies often seemed indecisive. On the one hand, he wanted to prevent or at least control German unification, but on the other hand, he shied away from an open conflict. In diplomatic negotiations, France tried to obtain compensation, such as territorial gains on the Rhine or in Luxembourg. But these demands met with resistance and led to mistrust rather than concessions. The so-called Luxembourg crisis in 1867 in particular showed the limits of French influence. When France tried to buy Luxembourg from the Dutch king, Prussia reacted with sharp rejection. The situation threatened to escalate, but international mediation prevented a war. Nevertheless, a bitter aftertaste remained. France had not achieved its goal and appeared weakened in foreign policy. Inside the country, the pressure continued to grow. Public opinion played an increasingly important role, and many French people called for a more decisive foreign policy. Nationalist voices gained influence and demanded that France defend its position as a great power. In the press, Prussia was increasingly portrayed as a threat, and the demand for a strong stance vis-à-vis its German rival grew louder. Napoleon III found himself in a dilemma. On the one hand, he had to react to domestic political tensions and secure his authority, but on the other hand, he was not allowed to show any weakness in foreign policy. For many of his supporters, a successful war seemed to be a possible way out, a means of strengthening national self-confidence and distracting from internal problems. But the reality was more complicated. Although the French army was considered to be rich in tradition and experienced in combat, it was not as modernized as the Prussian army. While Prussia relied on an efficient system of reserves, railway transports, and modern armaments, France was still dependent on outdated structures in many areas. However, these differences were often underestimated or ignored by the political leadership. In addition, Napoleon III was in poor health. His ability to make clear decisions and run the government effectively was limited. As a result, important political processes were often influenced by advisors, ministers, or the military, not always with a uniform strategy. France was also increasingly isolated at the diplomatic level. While Bismarck skillfully prevented alliances and neutralized potential opponents, France failed to win strong allies. Britain pursued a policy of restraint, Russia was well disposed towards Prussia, and Austria was unable to intervene actively after the defeat of 1866. France was thus largely alone. This isolation increased the pressure on the French leadership. Without strong allies, a quick, decisive strike against Prussia seemed all the more important before its power grew further. At the same time, the expectation grew among the population that the government had to act. The mood became increasingly heated and the willingness to engage in conflict increased. In this tense situation, a spark was enough to escalate the situation. The political, military, and social factors had built up over years. France felt challenged, pressured, and threatened in its role as a great power. The country thus entered a phase in which rational considerations were increasingly overshadowed by emotions, prestige, and domestic political constraints. Decisions were no longer made only according to strategic considerations, but also under the influence of public opinion and political necessities. The conflict with Prussia was not inevitable at this point, but the conditions for it had been created. France was at a point where every diplomatic crisis, every provocation, and every misunderstanding could tip the balance. And just such an event was about to occur, a seemingly diplomatic incident that would develop into one of the most consequential crises of the 19th century. Chapter 4: The Hohenzollern Candidacy. In the summer of 1870, tensions between France and Prussia intensified into a dangerous political crisis, triggered by an event that at first glance seemed far removed from the actual centers of power in Europe: the Spanish succession to the throne. Since the Revolution of 1868, the Spanish throne had been vacant. Queen Isabella II had been overthrown, and the country was looking for a new monarch to bring stability. Various candidates were examined, but none seemed to be permanently suitable. In this situation, the Spanish government finally turned to the House of Hohenzollern, more precisely to Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a Catholic prince from a sideline of the Prussian royal family. What at first seemed like a purely Spanish affair quickly developed into an international crisis. For France, the idea that a member of the Hohenzollern dynasty could ascend the Spanish throne was hardly acceptable. Suddenly, the country threatened to be surrounded on two sides by a family that was closely linked to Prussia, in the east by Prussia itself, in the south by Spain. This possible encirclement caused great concern in Paris. The French government under Emperor Napoleon III reacted accordingly, alarmed. Foreign Minister Gramont made it clear that France would not accept such a development. Leopold's candidacy was seen not only as a diplomatic challenge, but as a direct threat to national security and the European balance. But the situation was complicated. Officially, Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian Prime Minister, had little to do with the candidacy. The initiative had come from Spain, and King Wilhelm I also held back at first. Nevertheless, it was clear that a success of this candidacy would significantly strengthen Prussia's influence in Europe. Bismarck quickly recognized the potential of this situation. For him, the crisis offered an opportunity to put pressure on France diplomatically, and at the same time to push ahead with German unification. But at first, the development did not go entirely according to his ideas. Under massive diplomatic pressure from France, Leopold began to hesitate. The French government left no doubt that it was willing to go to great lengths to prevent the candidacy. Not only diplomatic notes were transmitted, but also indirect threats were made. France wanted to send a clear signal: this candidacy was unacceptable. Finally, Leopold gave in. On July 12, 1870, he officially withdrew his candidacy. At first glance, the crisis seemed to be defused. France had achieved its goal, and a possible conflict seemed to have been averted. But it was precisely at this point that the situation took a new turn. Instead of being satisfied with Leopold's withdrawal, the French government demanded further guarantees. She wanted to make sure that there would never be a similar candidacy in the future. This meant nothing less than a permanent commitment on the part of Prussia to renounce certain political options, a step that was considered inadmissible interference in Berlin. The French ambassador was then sent to a meeting with King Wilhelm I, who was staying in the spa town of Bad Ems at the time. There he was to deliver the demand that Prussia must officially and permanently renounce any support for a Hohenzollern candidacy for the Spanish throne. Wilhelm I reacted politely but firmly. He explained that he had already taken note of Leopold's decision and saw no further reason to comment on the matter. He rejected a permanent commitment. For him, the matter was closed. So this meeting initially took place without open escalation. There were no insults, no threats, just a diplomatic disagreement. But it was precisely this apparent calm that proved to be deceptive. When the news of the meeting reached Berlin, it fell into Bismarck's hands. He immediately realized that the situation was not over yet. On the contrary, it offered the opportunity to deliberately exacerbate tensions. Bismarck was aware that France was under strong domestic political pressure. The government in Paris had already raised great expectations and could hardly afford to appear weak. At the same time, he knew that the southern German states would stand by Prussia in the event of a French attack. A war with France could therefore be precisely the trigger that would lead to final German unity. The Hohenzollern candidacy was thus more than just a diplomatic incident. It became the catalyst for a development that had built up over years. National interests, political ambitions, and personal decisions combined to form an explosive mixture. France felt provoked and humiliated, even though it had achieved its original goal. Prussia, on the other hand, saw itself unjustly put under pressure and was not prepared to make further concessions. Both sides were increasingly trapped in their own logic, a logic that made compromise increasingly difficult. In addition, there was the role of the public. In both countries, newspapers reported intensively on the events, often in an exaggerated form. National feelings were stirred up, and the willingness for conflict grew. Politicians had to take into account not only foreign policy considerations, but also the expectations of their own people. In this atmosphere, every diplomatic gesture, every formulation, and every decision became of great importance. Misunderstandings could quickly lead to escalation, and that is exactly what happened in the days that followed. The Hohenzollern candidacy had triggered a chain reaction that could no longer be easily stopped. What had begun as a question of the Spanish throne developed into a European crisis. The fronts hardened, and the willingness to compromise decreased on both sides. Europe was once again on the brink of war, and this time it was not just a question of territories or alliances, but of prestige, power, and national honor. The next development was to show how a diplomatic crisis turned into an open conflict. A single document, a targeted formulation, and the clever use of information would be enough to drop the last inhibitions. The path to war was thus almost completely paved. Chapter 5: The Ems Dispatch. The crisis over the Hohenzollern candidacy could actually have come to an end in the summer of 1870. The renunciation of Leopold von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen seemed to have averted the immediate danger of conflict. But what followed was a lesson in political escalation, triggered not by weapons, but by words. At the center of this development was a seemingly inconspicuous document, the so-called Ems Dispatch. The starting point was the meeting between the Prussian King Wilhelm I and the French ambassador Benedetti in the spa town of Bad Ems. The ambassador had come on behalf of his government to convey a far-reaching demand. Prussia should commit itself not to support any Hohenzollern candidacy for the Spanish throne in the future. So it was no longer just about the already withdrawn candidacy, but about a lasting political assurance. Wilhelm I met the ambassador with politeness and restraint. He explained that he had accepted Leopold's withdrawal and saw no reason to make further commitments. For him, the matter was closed. The conversation was calm, without open tensions. There were no insults, no threats, just a clear but diplomatic rejection of the French demand. Following this meeting, Wilhelm I had a summary of the conversation sent to Berlin. This message, formulated objectively and without any particular drama, was intended for the Prussian Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck. When Bismarck received the dispatch, he immediately recognized its political explosive power. The situation between France and Prussia was already tense, and public opinion in both countries was already heated. For Bismarck, this was an opportunity to deliberately increase these tensions, and thus possibly trigger a war that would serve his long-term goals. Bismarck was convinced that a conflict with France was inevitable and that, if properly managed, it could complete German unity. The southern German states, which have so far hesitated to join Prussia completely, would probably give up their reservations in the event of a French attack and show solidarity. A war could therefore bring not only military but also political results. But in order to achieve this goal, France had to appear as the aggressor. Prussia could not be considered the one who started the war. This is exactly where Bismarck's strategy came in. He took the original factual dispatch and shortened it purposefully. In doing so, he not only removed details, but also changed the tone of the message. The new version made the meeting between Wilhelm I and the French ambassador seem much more tense than it had actually been. The impression was created that the king had brusquely rejected the ambassador and refused further talks. This edited version was subsequently published and distributed to the press. What followed was a wave of indignation. both in France and in the German states. In France, the dispatch was perceived as a grave insult. The impression that the French ambassador had been publicly rejected and that national honor had been violated caused great indignation. Newspapers reported in sharp tones, politicians demanded consequences, and anger grew among the population. The pressure on the government under Napoleon III increased massively. The French leadership was now in a difficult position. On the one hand, she had achieved her original goal. The Hohenzollern candidacy had been withdrawn. On the other hand, she could hardly afford to leave the supposed humiliation unanswered. At a time when national honor and prestige played a central role, giving in appeared as a sign of weakness. The dispatch also had a strong effect in Prussia and the other German states. There it was interpreted as evidence of France's excessive demands. Many saw the behavior of the French ambassador as an inadmissible interference in internal affairs. Public opinion increasingly backed the Prussian leadership. Bismarck had thus achieved what he had intended. The mood on both sides was so heated that a diplomatic way out became increasingly unlikely. The Ems Dispatch acted like a spark in an already prepared powder keg. The following days were marked by intensive political consultations. In Paris, the government discussed how to proceed. Military options were examined, diplomatic contacts intensified, but the room for maneuver became increasingly narrow. Public opinion urged decisive action, and the political leadership could hardly escape this pressure. At the same time, it became apparent that France was largely isolated internationally. It was not possible to mobilize strong allies who would provide support in a possible conflict. Nevertheless, the willingness to take the risk of war grew. On July 19, 1870, the time had finally come. France declared war on Prussia. For Bismarck, this was the decisive moment. His strategy had worked. Prussia could now present itself as an attacked party, and the southern German states declared their support. The war, which he had regarded as a means of German unity, had become a reality. The Ems Dispatch had played a central role in this. It was not a product of chance, but the result of deliberate political manipulation. Bismarck had shown how powerful words can be, how a deliberate change in information can be enough to set entire nations in motion. But the dispatch was not the sole cause of the war. Rather, it was the trigger that accelerated an already existing development. Tensions between France and Prussia had been building up over years, due to political rivalry, military rearmament, and national ambitions. The events surrounding the Ems Dispatch show how closely diplomacy and power politics can be linked. They make it clear that wars do not always start with direct attacks, but are often prepared by misunderstandings, provocations, and strategic decisions. For the people of Europe, the declaration of war marked the beginning of a new phase. What had previously been a political conflict now became a military one. Armies were mobilized, plans were implemented, and battles were prepared. The coming weeks were to show how quickly the situation could develop, and how profound the consequences of this war would be. To this day, the Ems Dispatch remains a symbol of the power of communication in politics. It reminds us that history is not only written by deeds, but also by words, and that sometimes a single text is enough to change the course of the world. Chapter 6: Declaration of War and Mobilization. On July 19, 1870, the time had finally come. France officially declared war on Prussia. What had built up over years and had been exacerbated in the weeks before by diplomatic tensions and political provocations now erupted in open conflict. For many contemporaries, this step did not come as a surprise, and yet it marked a decisive turning point. Words became weapons. Rivalry became war. In Paris, the declaration of war was initially received with enthusiasm by large parts of the population. Nationalist feelings had built up over weeks, fueled by the press and political speeches. Many French people were convinced that their country was militarily superior and could quickly win the conflict. They remembered past military successes and trusted in the strength of their own army. Emperor Napoleon III himself was under enormous pressure. The domestic political situation was tense. His authority was increasingly being questioned, and a military success seemed to be a way to consolidate his position. The decision to go to war was therefore not only motivated by foreign policy, but also an attempt to maintain control at home. But behind the initial euphoria, the first problems were already hidden. The French mobilization was slower and more chaotic than expected. Although France had a large army, its organization left much to be desired. Many units were not fully equipped, coordination between different units was insufficient, and there was a lack of clear strategic plans. In contrast, mobilization in Prussia went almost smoothly. Under the leadership of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, the Prussian military system had developed remarkable efficiency in the years before. A sophisticated system of reserves, precise planning, and the targeted use of the railway made it possible to bring large numbers of troops to the front quickly and in a coordinated manner. A decisive advantage of Prussia was the integration of the southern German states. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt sided with Prussia after the French declaration of war. Thus, a conflict between two states became an all-German war. For many Germans, this was a moment of national unity, a common struggle against an external enemy. Mobilization was carried out with great discipline in the German states. Within a few days, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were called up, equipped, and transferred to the western border. The railway played a central role in this. It not only enabled the rapid transport of troops, but also the supply of weapons, ammunition, and food. Meanwhile, France tried to take the initiative. The original plan was to advance quickly into German territory and wage war on foreign soil. But this plan failed in the early stages. The French troops were not ready in time, and coordination between the various armies did not work as planned. Another problem was the lead. Napoleon III formally assumed supreme command of the army, but his health problems and lack of military experience made it difficult to lead it effectively. Decisions were delayed or contradictory, and there was a lack of a clear strategic line. On the Prussian side, on the other hand, the leadership was clearly structured. Helmuth von Moltke planned the war with great precision. His goal was to quickly locate, isolate, and defeat the French armies in decisive battles. In doing so, he relied on movement, coordination, and the targeted use of logistical advantages. The first days of the war were marked by reconnaissance, troop movements, and minor battles. Both sides tried to get an idea of the situation and secure their positions. But it soon became apparent that the Prussian army was better prepared. An important factor was military training. The Prussian soldiers had gone through a systematic training system based on discipline, obedience, and tactical understanding. The officers were also well trained and able to make decisions independently. This allowed for flexible and effective warfare. The French army, on the other hand, was still characterized by traditional structures in many areas. Although it had experienced soldiers and modern weapons such as the Chassepot rifle, the organization and leadership could not keep up with Prussian efficiency. Communication also played a decisive role. Prussia used telegraphy and railways to quickly transmit information and implement decisions. France had disadvantages in this area, which made it difficult to coordinate the troops. As the military forces formed, the mood of the population also changed. The initial enthusiasm slowly gave way to a more serious attitude. The reality of the war became palpable. Families were separated, soldiers were bid farewell, and uncertainty about the outcome of the conflict grew. In Germany, the war strengthened national consciousness. The joint mobilization and the fight against an external opponent created a feeling of togetherness that went beyond regional differences. In France, on the other hand, the initial confidence began to mix with concern as the first problems became apparent. The declaration of war had set in motion a dynamic that could no longer be stopped. Both sides were now fully focused on the conflict. Resources were mobilized, strategies implemented, and expectations built. But even at this early stage, it became apparent that the war would turn out differently than many in France had hoped. The structural differences between the two armies, the efficiency of Prussian mobilization, and the clear strategic leadership began to have an effect. The stage was set for the first major battles. The troops faced each other, ready to seek the decision. What followed was to show how quickly a war can develop, and how crucial preparation, organization, and leadership are for its outcome. The following chapters will take a closer look at these first military conflicts. They will show how mobilization turned into concrete battles, and how the further course of the war was already apparent in the first battles. Chapter 7: The First Battles. After the declaration of war and rapid mobilization, the armies of France and Prussia met directly for the first time in August 1870. What had previously been prepared by diplomatic tensions and strategic planning now turned into open military conflicts. The first battles were not only to decide the immediate course of the war, but also to reveal the fundamental strengths and weaknesses of both sides. The French leadership had originally planned to quickly seize the initiative and advance into German territory. But this plan failed in the early stages. Delays in mobilization, lack of coordination, and unclear command structures meant that the French troops were not ready in time. Instead, it was the German armies that moved first. Under the strategic leadership of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, several Prussian and Allied German armies systematically advanced towards the French border. Their goal was to quickly locate the French forces, tie them down, and defeat them in decisive battles. In doing so, they took advantage of their organizational advantages, in particular the efficient use of the railway and the clear structure of their command chains. The first major battles took place at the beginning of August. On August 4, 1870, the Battle of Weissenberg took place. French troops under General Abel Douay were stationed there, without being fully aware of the immediate danger. The German forces attacked by surprise and were able to break through the French lines quickly. Douay fell in the course of the fighting, and the French troops had to retreat. The Battle of Weissenberg was militarily limited, but its psychological impact was enormous. It showed that the German armies were ready and could act effectively, while the French forces were still organizing. The surprise effect and determination of the attackers made it clear that the war would not take the expected course. Only a few days later, on August 6, two more decisive battles followed: the Battle of Worth, also known as the Battle of Froschwiller, and the Battle of Spitzern. Both battles took place almost simultaneously and reinforced the impression that the initiative was clearly on the German side. At Worth, German troops met the army of French Marshal Patrice de MacMahon. The French soldiers defended their positions with great bravery, and their modern chassepot rifles in particular proved effective. Nevertheless, they could not withstand the massive pressure of the German attacks. The numerical superiority, better coordination, and continuous reinforcements eventually led to the collapse of the French lines. MacMahon had to retreat, and the way was clear for further German advances. At the same time, another battle developed near Spitzern. Here, too, the French troops were initially in a defensive position, but the German units attacked resolutely. Despite difficult terrain and strong resistance, they managed to overcome the French positions. The battle was marked by intense fighting and heavy losses on both sides, but in the end the French troops had to retreat here as well. These early defeats had far-reaching consequences. Within days, France lost control of key border areas, and the army's morale was severely affected. The initial confidence increasingly gave way to uncertainty. The reality of the war did not live up to expectations, and the structural problems of the French armed forces became increasingly apparent. A central problem was the lack of coordination between the different armies. Orders were delayed or communicated unclearly, and there was a lack of a unified strategy. While the German troops worked together in a targeted manner and coordinated their movements, the French units often acted in isolation from each other. The lead also played a decisive role. On the German side, officers were able to act independently and react flexibly to changes. This principle of mission tactics made it possible to quickly seize opportunities and react to unexpected situations. On the French side, on the other hand, many decisions were highly centralized, which limited the ability to react. The differences in organization were also evident in logistics. The German armies were continuously supplied with supplies, while the French troops were repeatedly shortened. Ammunition, food and equipment were not always sufficiently available, which further impaired the combat capability. Despite these difficulties, many French soldiers showed great courage and commitment. In the battles of Worth and Spitzern, there were always fierce counterattacks, and individual units put up fierce resistance. But without sufficient support and clear leadership, these efforts could not decisively influence the outcome of the fighting. The German losses were also considerable. The attacks against well-defended positions claimed many victims, and the battles were often hard and costly. Nevertheless, the German armies were able to achieve their goals and further expand their position. For the civilian population in the affected areas, a period of great uncertainty began. Villages and towns became the scene of military operations, and many people had to leave their homes or adapt to the conditions of war. The conflict, which had previously taken place mainly at the political level, was now felt in people's everyday lives. In France itself, the news of the defeats spread quickly. The initial enthusiasm for the war increasingly gave way to worry. The government faced growing criticism, and calls for clear decisions grew louder. At the same time, it became clear that the war would not be as quick and easy to win as many had hoped. In the German states, on the other hand, the successes strengthened self-confidence. The victories were seen as proof of the strength of their own army and the correctness of the political leadership. The war began to bring the various German states closer together and create a common national feeling. The first battles of the Franco-German War had thus set a clear direction. The initiative lay with the German armies, and France was increasingly on the defensive. The structural differences between the two sides became visible, and the dynamics of the conflict developed in favor of Prussia and its allies. But the war was far from over. The French armies were regrouping, and further major conflicts were imminent. One of these battles was to be particularly decisive, not only for the military course, but also for the political future of France. The coming events would show how quickly the fate of a country can change, and how closely military success and political stability are linked. Chapter 8: The Battle of Sedan. After the first defeats, France's military situation came under increasing pressure. The armies were weakened, coordination remained difficult, and the initiative remained clearly on the side of Prussia and its allies. In this tense situation, a decision was made that would change the course of the entire war, the Battle of Sedan. At the center of the events was once again Emperor Napoleon III. Despite his health problems, he had placed himself at the head of the army to show leadership and strengthen the confidence of the population. Together with Marshal Patrice de MacMahon, he led a large French force whose aim was to relieve the trapped army of Marshal Bazaine in Metz. This plan was risky. The French troops had to move through an area where strong German forces were already operating. In addition, communication between the various units was insufficient, and the movements of the German armies were underestimated. While the French leadership was trying to join forces, the German troops under the strategic leadership of Helmuth von Moltke, the Elder, had already begun to encircle their opponents in a targeted manner. The French army was moving towards the small town of Sedan, near the Belgian border. The terrain there was unfavorable for defense. The city was located in a valley basin, surrounded by hills that offered ideal positions for artillery. Nevertheless, the French leadership decided to take a stand there, partly out of exhaustion, partly due to a lack of alternatives. The German armies quickly recognized the opportunity. Several corps advanced simultaneously to encircle the French forces. Within a short time, they managed to achieve an almost complete embrace. The French army was now in a strategically extremely unfavorable position, encircled, with limited means of evasion and under constant pressure. On September 1, 1870, the actual battle began. The German troops opened fire in the early hours of the morning. Their artillery, positioned on the surrounding heights, was able to effectively bombard French territory. Shells hit the French lines, causing casualties and making any form of orderly movement difficult. The French soldiers tried to defend themselves and launch counterattacks. The cavalry in particular made several desperate attacks to break through the German lines. These attacks were carried out with great courage, but they were hardly successful militarily. The German infantry and artillery were able to repel the attackers, often with heavy losses on the French side. Another decisive factor was the coordination of the German forces. While the French units often fought in isolation, the German armies worked closely together. Orders were transmitted quickly, and the individual units supported each other. This allowed them to continuously maintain pressure and stop French defense attempts. In the course of the day, the situation for France deteriorated increasingly. Attempts to break out of the cauldron failed, and losses mounted. The French leadership found itself in an increasingly hopeless position. Marshal MacMahon was wounded early in the battle, which further exacerbated the already difficult leadership situation. Napoleon III himself was in the middle of the action. He was able to observe the development of the battle directly, and had to realize that the situation had gotten out of control. The army was encircled, the losses were high, and a breakthrough seemed impossible. In the afternoon, it became clear that the French army was no longer able to continue the fight. The German troops had consolidated their positions, the encirclement was complete, and the French units were exhausted and demoralized. In this situation, there was only one decision left: surrender. On September 2, 1870, Napoleon III surrendered to the German forces together with his army. More than 100,000 French soldiers were taken prisoner, an event of enormous significance. It was not only a military defeat, but also a political shock. The capture of the emperor had a direct impact on the political situation in France. A head of state in captivity was a symbol of the collapse of the existing order. The news spread quickly throughout the country, triggering a wave of outrage and uncertainty. In Paris, the news led to revolution. The Second Empire collapsed, and on September 4, 1870, the Republic was proclaimed. The political leadership changed, but the war was not yet over. On the contrary, the new government was determined to continue the struggle. For the German states, on the other hand, the victory of Sedan was a decisive success. He confirmed military superiority and strengthened confidence in his own leadership. At the same time, the battle had enormous symbolic significance. The French emperor had been defeated, and German unification was within reach. The Battle of Sedan thus marked a turning point in the war. It showed how crucial strategic planning, coordination, and leadership can be for the outcome of a conflict. At the same time, she highlighted the consequences of misjudgments and inadequate preparation. But despite this clear victory, the war was not over yet. The new French government was ready to continue fighting, and the coming months were to show that the conflict was far from decided. However, the events of Sedan had already made history. They had not only sealed the fate of an emperor, but also permanently changed the political landscape of Europe. Chapter 9: The Fall of the Empire. The news of the defeat at Sedan and the capture of Napoleon III spread like wildfire throughout France in early September 1870. What initially appeared to be a military setback developed into a political catastrophe of historic proportions within a few days. The Second Empire, which had shaped the country for almost 2 decades, collapsed, not through a slow process, but through a sudden dramatic upheaval. In Paris, the political and social center of the country, the news triggered a wave of indignation. The population was shocked and angry at the same time. The defeat was perceived not only as a military failure, but also as proof of the incompetence of the political leadership. The capture of the emperor was considered a national humiliation that finally shook confidence in the existing system. Discontent had been building up internally for some time. Liberal and Republican forces had demanded reforms, demanded more co-determination, and criticized the authoritarian structure of the empire. The military failures increased these tensions considerably. Now the moment had come when this dissatisfaction was unleashed. On September 4, 1870, thousands of people gathered in Paris. Demonstrations formed, political groups mobilized their supporters, and calls for fundamental political change were raised. Finally, demonstrators broke into the Parliament building and declared the end of the empire. On the same day, the Republic was proclaimed. This marked the beginning of a new phase in France's history, the so-called Third Republic. A provisional government was formed, consisting of politicians from different tendencies who agreed on a common goal: the defense of the country and the continuation of the war. However, this new government faced enormous challenges. The country was at war, large parts of the army had been defeated or captured, and the German troops continued to advance. At the same time, the political order had to be reorganized, while public opinion remained tense. Despite this difficult starting position, the new leadership decided not to give up the fight. On the contrary, the defeat of Sedan was seen as an incentive to continue the resistance. The aim was to show that France was able to defend itself even without an emperor. The idea of the People's War played a central role in this. New armies were formed, volunteers came forward, and resistance was organized more broadly. The government tried to mobilize all available resources to stop the advance of the German troops. But the reality was sobering. The military situation remained difficult. Many experienced soldiers were in captivity, and the newly formed troops were often poorly trained and inadequately equipped. In addition, there was still a lack of clear strategic leadership. Communication was also a problem. Paris, which was soon to be surrounded by German troops, was cut off from many regions. The government had to improvise to transmit information and coordinate orders. In some cases, balloons were even used to carry messages beyond the besieged city. The mood among the population was contradictory. On the one hand, there was a strong willingness to resist, a sense of national solidarity, and a desire not to accept defeat. On the other hand, exhaustion, fear of further losses, and concern for the future also grew. In the provinces, local authorities tried to organize resistance. New units were formed, defensive positions were erected, and supply routes were secured. But coordination between these regional initiatives and the central government has often been difficult. Meanwhile, the German troops continued to exploit their advantage. They systematically advanced, occupied important cities, and cut off communication routes. Their goal was to break the resistance and force France to surrender. The political situation remained unstable. Within the new government, there were different ideas about how the war should be waged. Some pleaded for negotiations, others wanted to continue the fight at all costs. These tensions made decision-making difficult and led to uncertainty. At the same time, the role of the population changed. The war was no longer waged only by professional soldiers, but increasingly by citizens who volunteered. This led to a new dynamic, but also to new challenges, as these forces were often less organized. The events after Sedan showed how closely military and political developments are intertwined. Defeat on the battlefield led directly to the collapse of a political system. At the same time, this crisis gave rise to a new form of resistance that shaped the further course of the war. The fall of the German Empire was thus not only a national event, but also a signal for Europe. He showed how quickly political structures can change when they come under pressure. At the same time, he made it clear that the war was far from over. The new republic faced the difficult task of stabilizing itself in the midst of an ongoing conflict. It had to gain trust, build structures, and at the same time organize military resistance. A task that would have been difficult under normal circumstances, but seemed almost overwhelming under the conditions of war. The coming months would show whether France would succeed in regrouping and withstand the pressure. At the center of this development was a city that would soon become a symbol of resistance: Paris. There, in the heart of the country, it was to be decided whether the new republic could meet its first major challenges, or whether the war was finally lost. Chapter 10: The Siege of Paris. After the collapse of the empire and the proclamation of the republic, the center of the war shifted inexorably to Paris. The city was not only the political heart of France, but also a symbol of national identity, resistance, and hope. For the new Republican government, it was clear that as long as Paris held out, the war was not lost. But it was precisely this importance that made the city the main target of the German strategy. As early as September 1870, the troops of Prussia and its allies systematically advanced towards the French capital. Under the leadership of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, a plan was implemented that did not rely on a direct storm of the city, but on a complete encirclement. The aim was to cut off Paris from the outside world, cut off supplies, and force the population and defenders to surrender. On September 19, 1870, the siege officially began. Within a short time, the city was completely surrounded. Railway lines were interrupted, roads blocked, and communication routes cut. Paris was now isolated, a city of millions, surrounded by enemy troops, without direct access to food, supplies, or support. At the beginning, there was still a certain confidence in the city. Many residents believed that the siege would be short-lived. It was trusted that the newly formed French armies in the provinces would break through the German lines and liberate the city. At the same time, the defenses began to be strengthened. The existing forts around Paris were occupied, new positions were built, and the National Guard was mobilized. But over time, the reality of the situation became apparent. The supply situation deteriorated increasingly. Food became scarce, prices rose, and the government had to take measures to ration existing resources. At first, luxury goods were hit, but soon basic food became scarce. The population had to adapt to life under extreme conditions. Horse meat became an important source of food, later even animals from the city's zoos. Bread was rationed, and many people suffered from hunger and malnutrition. The long winter months further exacerbated the situation. Cold, illness, and exhaustion spread. Despite these difficult circumstances, the will to resist initially remained strong. The Republican government, which remained in Paris, tried to maintain morale. Newspapers reported successes on other fronts, speeches appealed to the patriotic spirit, and the population was encouraged to persevere. A special feature of the siege was the improvised communication with the outside world. Since all conventional routes were blocked, unusual methods were used. Hot air balloons were used to carry messages across enemy lines. At the same time, attempts were made to bring information back to the city by carrier pigeons. These measures were not always reliable, but they symbolized the unbroken will to overcome isolation. Militarily, the situation remained tense. Again and again, French troops tried to break out of the city and break through the German lines. These failures were carried out with great commitment, but they were mostly unsuccessful. The German troops had secured their positions well and were able to repel attacks. Tensions also arose within the city. The long duration of the siege, the difficult living conditions, and the uncertainty about the outcome of the war led to growing discontent. Political groups began to organize, and discussions arose about the right strategy. Some demanded negotiations, others wanted to continue the resistance at all costs. The government faced a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, it had to organize defense and maintain morale, but on the other hand, it also had to respond to increasing social tensions. Decisions were made under enormous pressure, and not all measures were approved. Meanwhile, the German troops continued their strategy. Instead of attacking the city directly, they maintained the encirclement and waited for the situation inside Paris to deteriorate further. This strategy proved to be effective. With each passing day, the pressure on the city increased, and the opportunities to resist diminished. In January 1871, the situation reached its peak. The supply was almost exhausted, the population exhausted, and the military possibilities severely limited. In this situation, the government began to think about surrendering. On January 28, 1871, an armistice was finally agreed. The siege of Paris was over. For the city, this meant the end of months of deprivation, but at the same time it was an admission of defeat. The consequences of the siege were profound. Paris had suffered enormously, both materially and socially. The experiences of these months shaped the collective memory of the population and left deep traces in the political life of the country. But the events were not yet over. The tensions within the city that had arisen during the siege would soon lead to a new conflict, a conflict that was no longer fought between France and Germany, but within France itself. The siege of Paris was thus not only a military event, but also a turning point in the history of the country. It showed the limits of resistance, the effects of modern war on a large city, and the complex interactions between military and social developments. With the end of the siege, the war was practically decided, but its political and social consequences were to have a long-lasting effect. Chapter 11: The War in the Province. While Europe's attention was focused on the siege of Paris, an equally crucial part of the war took place far from the capital, in the provinces of France. There, the young republic desperately tried to maintain resistance, form new armies, and stop the advance of Prussian troops. The war was no longer just a conflict between regular armies, but increasingly developed into a comprehensive people's war. After the defeat of Sedan and the collapse of the empire, France was faced with a military shambles. Large parts of the regular army had been defeated or captured, experienced officers were lacking, and the military organization was severely impaired. Nevertheless, the new Republican administration decided to continue the fight, even without the resources and structures that had previously been available. In the provinces, therefore, new armed forces began to be formed. These so-called armies of the Republic consisted of a mixture of remaining regular soldiers, reservists, volunteers, and members of the National Guard. Léon Gambetta, who played a central role in organizing the resistance, was particularly committed. After leaving Paris in a balloon, he coordinated the formation of new armies from outside the besieged capital. Gambetta's goal was to put the war on a new footing. Instead of relying on individual major battles, the resistance was to be organized nationwide. New troops were to be formed, trained, and quickly sent to the front. At the same time, attempts were made to slow down the advance of the German troops through targeted attacks and disruptions. But this approach brought with it major challenges. The newly established units were often poorly trained and inadequately equipped. There was a lack of weapons, ammunition, and experienced officers. In addition, coordination between the different armies was difficult, as communication channels were limited and central structures had to be set up first. Despite these problems, intense fighting broke out in various regions. One of the most important fronts developed in the Loire region, where French troops tried to break through the German lines and fight their way to Paris. Several battles were fought, and at times the French units managed to achieve successes and recapture territories. But these successes were usually short-lived. The German troops reacted quickly, organized counterattacks, and were able to consolidate their positions again. Their military superiority, especially in terms of organization, communication, and logistics, made it difficult for the French units to make sustained progress. Another important aspect of the war in the province was the use of so-called Francs-tireurs. These were irregular fighters who operated independently of the regular armies. They carried out guerrilla attacks, attacked supply lines, and tried to disrupt the movements of German troops. This form of warfare presented the German troops with new challenges. The attacks were often unpredictable and difficult to control. At the same time, the German armed forces reacted with harsh measures to prevent these activities. This led to tensions between the population and the occupying troops in many regions. For the civilian population in the provinces, the war meant a time of great uncertainty and strain. Cities and villages were occupied, resources were confiscated, and people had to get used to the presence of foreign troops. At the same time, many men were at the front, which put an additional strain on the economic and social structure. The government tried to maintain resistance and boost morale. Propaganda played an important role in this. Newspapers reported successes, speeches appealed to the patriotic spirit, and the population was encouraged to continue fighting. But over time, it became increasingly difficult to maintain this confidence. A decisive factor was increasing exhaustion. The country's resources were limited, and the continuous struggles took their toll. The supply of the troops became increasingly difficult, and the population also suffered from the burdens of the war. Meanwhile, the German troops continued to pursue their strategic goals. They secured important regions, controlled transport routes, and tried to systematically break the resistance. Their approach was characterized by efficiency and planning, which allowed them to maintain the upper hand in the provinces as well. A particularly clear example of the difficulties of the French side was the lack of unity in the leadership. Different commanders pursued different strategies, and there was often a lack of clear coordination. This led to opportunities being missed and resources being used inefficiently. Nevertheless, the resistance in the provinces should not be underestimated. Despite all the problems, the French forces managed to prolong the war and slow down the German advance. They showed that France was ready to continue fighting even after heavy defeats. The events in the provinces also had a political dimension. They strengthened the feeling that the war was not only waged by a government or an army, but by the entire nation. At the same time, the stresses led to new tensions, which were later to be reflected in domestic political conflicts. When the siege of Paris ended in January 1871, resistance in the provinces had already been severely weakened. Resources were exhausted, military capabilities were limited, and the prospect of victory was slim. Nevertheless, these months had shown how far a nation can go to defend itself. The war in the province was thus an important part of the overall event. He added another dimension to the great battles and the siege of Paris, that of comprehensive, often improvised resistance. With the end of this phase, the war was nearing its end. The military decision had been made, and now political negotiations came to the fore. The question was no longer whether the war would end, but under what conditions. The following events were to show how military success became political reality, and how a new state emerged that was to permanently change the balance of power in Europe. Chapter 12: The Founding of the Empire. While the war was still going on and the fighting in France had not yet completely ended, a historic event of enormous significance took place on the German side: the founding of the German Empire. What had been discussed for decades as an idea, as a political goal, and as a controversial project now became reality. In the middle of the war, supported by military success, political calculation, and national enthusiasm. The path to this moment had already been prepared in the years before. Under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, Prussia had systematically expanded its position within the German states. The victories against Denmark and Austria had rearranged the balance of power, and a political foundation had already been created with the North German Confederation. But the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, had initially remained outside this federation. It was not until the war against France that this situation changed fundamentally. The common threat led the southern German states to side with Prussia militarily. What began as an alliance in the war quickly developed into a political rapprochement. The idea of a united Germany gained momentum, and the war acted as a catalyst for this process. Bismarck took advantage of this development in a targeted manner. While the military operations continued, he conducted intensive negotiations with the southern German governments. The aim was to integrate them permanently into a German nation-state, under Prussian leadership. These negotiations were complex, as the southern German states wanted to preserve their independence and were skeptical about full integration. In order to win their approval, Bismarck made concessions. The southern German states were given certain special rights, for example in the area of internal administration or the military. At the same time, it was emphasized that the new state was not only a Prussian project, but a common German Reich. At the same time, a strong national consciousness also developed among the population. The military successes were seen as a joint achievement, and the desire for unity was reinforced by the war. Newspapers, speeches, and public events helped to spread and consolidate this mood. The decisive moment finally came in January 1871. The German princes and political leaders gathered at the Palace of Versailles, a place of great symbolic importance. Versailles had not only been the residence of the French kings, but also a symbol of the power and splendor of France. The fact that the founding of a German empire was to take place here of all places was a deliberately chosen sign. On January 18, 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Wilhelm I, the previous King of Prussia, was proclaimed German Emperor. The ceremony was marked by military pomp, political speeches, and a strong sense of historical significance. For many contemporaries, this moment was the fulfillment of a long-cherished dream. German unity, which had previously failed due to political conflicts and differing interests, had now become a reality, not through revolution, but through war and diplomacy. But the founding of the Reich was not just a symbolic event. It also marked the beginning of a new political system. The German Empire was a federal state in which the individual states retained a certain autonomy. At the same time, a central government was created, with Bismarck as Reich Chancellor at the head. The constitution of the new empire combined monarchical and parliamentary elements. The emperor had far-reaching powers, especially in foreign and military policy, while an elected parliament, the Reichstag, was involved in legislation. This system reflected the political realities of the time, the influence of monarchies as well as the growing importance of parliamentary structures. Internationally, the founding of the empire had far-reaching effects. With the new empire, a strong united power emerged in the center of Europe. This significantly altered the balance of power. States such as the UK, Russia, and Austria-Hungary have had to adapt their strategies to deal with this new reality. For France, the founding of the empire was a particular humiliation. It took place not only during a lost war, but also on French soil. This increased the sense of defeat and contributed to the long-term enmity between the two countries. Despite the euphoria on the German side, however, the situation was not free of tensions. The integration of the various states into a common empire was a complex process that required time and political skill. Different interests, regional identities, and political ideas had to be reconciled. The role of Prussia within the new Reich was also a sensitive topic. As the dominant power, Prussia had great influence, but at the same time care had to be taken to ensure that the other states did not feel subordinate. Bismarck was aware of this challenge and tried to create a balance. The founding of the empire was thus both a highlight and a starting point. It marked the end of a long process of national unification, but at the same time opened a new phase in European history. The German Empire was not only a new state, but a political factor that was to have a significant influence on the developments of the coming decades. While the celebrations were taking place in Versailles, however, the war was not yet completely over. In France, resistance continued and political negotiations were still pending. But the military and political decision had been made. The founding of the German Empire was the result of planning, strategy, and opportunity. It showed how closely military success and political development can be linked. At the same time, she made it clear that historical changes often occur in moments of great crisis. For the people in the German states, this moment meant a profound change. A multitude of individual states had become a nation-state, with common institutions, a common leadership, and a new self-image. The consequences of this development were to reach far beyond the war. They would shape European politics, create new conflicts, and lay the groundwork for future events. The founding of the German Empire was thus not only the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one, a chapter that was to change the history of Europe permanently. Chapter 13, the Peace of Frankfurt. After months of intense fighting, the defeat at Sedan, the siege of Paris, and the founding of the German Empire, the war between France and the German Empire was about to be formally concluded. The military decision had been made, but now it was a matter of political and territorial reorganization, the conditions under which peace was to be concluded. During the last months of the war, it had already become apparent that France would be forced to negotiate. The military situation had become hopeless, resources depleted, and the population was severely weakened by hunger, losses, and the stresses of war. After the armistice of January 1871, the process that was to lead to the final peace treaty finally began. The negotiations were characterized by a clear power imbalance. The German Empire was in a position of strength, while France was forced to make concessions. On the German side, Otto von Bismarck again played a central role. His goal was to create a peace that would politically secure military successes and at the same time bring long-term strategic advantages. On May 10, 1871, the so-called Peace of Frankfurt was finally signed, a treaty that was to have far-reaching consequences for both countries and the whole of Europe. A central point of the treaty was the cession of territories. France had to cede the regions of Alsace and parts of Lorraine to the German Empire. These areas were not only economically significant, but also had a strong symbolic and cultural significance. Many of its inhabitants continued to feel French, although they now became part of a new state. The decision on this cession of territory was controversial on the German side. While some argued that the regions historically and linguistically belonged to Germany, others warned of the long-term consequences. Bismarck himself was aware that this measure would provoke resentment in France, but he considered it necessary for strategic reasons. The new borders were to be easier to defend militarily and to secure the German Reich against future attacks. Another important part of the contract was the payment of a high war indemnity. France undertook to pay 5 billion francs to the German Reich, an enormous sum that placed a heavy burden on the country's economic capacity. This payment was not only intended to cover the costs of the war, but also to strengthen Germany's economic position. To ensure that these payments were made, part of France remained temporarily occupied by German troops. Only after the compensation had been paid in full were these troops to withdraw. This occupation was another sign of defeat for many French people and increased the feeling of humiliation. The effects of the peace treaty were profound in France. The defeat and the harsh conditions led to a political and social crisis. The new Republican administration faced the difficult task of stabilizing the country, coping with the economic burdens, and at the same time regaining the trust of the population. The territorial losses also had an emotional dimension. Many people in France felt that the cession of Alsace-Lorraine was a national loss that could not be accepted. The desire for revenge, i.e., for the recovery of these territories, became a central element of French politics and shaped relations with Germany for decades. In the German Empire, on the other hand, the peace agreement was celebrated as a great success. The military victories had led to national unity, and the Treaty of Frankfurt seemed to secure these successes permanently. The new territories were integrated into the empire, and the war reparations contributed to economic development. But here, too, there were critical voices. Some politicians and observers warned that the harsh conditions of peace could lead to tensions in the long term. They feared that France would not accept defeat and that the conflict was merely postponed but not resolved. Internationally, the Peace of Frankfurt was closely observed. The other European powers recognized that the balance of power had changed fundamentally. The German Empire had become the dominant force on the continent, while France was weakened. This new situation led to a period of reorientation in European politics. The long-term consequences of the treaty were considerable. The rivalry between Germany and France was further exacerbated by the events of the war and the conditions of peace. Mistrust, resentment, and political tensions shaped relations between the two countries and formed an important background for later conflicts. At the same time, the Peace of Frankfurt showed how closely military and political developments are linked. The outcome of the war determined the conditions of peace, and these conditions in turn influenced the future development of Europe. For the people in both countries, the end of the war meant a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The immediate conflict was over, but the consequences were felt. Families had suffered losses, cities had been destroyed, and political systems had changed. The Treaty of Frankfurt thus marked not only the end of a war, but also the beginning of a new phase in European history. He created an order based on the results of military might, while laying the groundwork for future tensions. The events of this chapter show that a peace treaty is not only a conclusion, but also a starting point. The decisions made in Frankfurt had an impact far beyond the moment and influenced relations between European states for decades. With the conclusion of peace, the Franco-German War was formally over, but its effects were to have a long-lasting effect. Europe's political landscape had changed, and the next developments would show how stable this new order actually was. Chapter 14: Consequences for Europe. The Franco-German War of 1870–71 was formally ended with the Treaty of Frankfurt, but its effects extended far beyond the immediate end of the war. In fact, the victory of the newly founded German Empire and the defeat of France marked the beginning of a new epoch in European history, marked by changing power relations, growing nationalism and long-term tensions that were to influence the continent into the 20th century. Probably the most significant consequence of the war was the fundamental shift in the European balance of power. With the founding of the Reich, a new strong nation-state had emerged in the center of Europe. The German Empire combined economic strength, military efficiency, and political unity to an extent that had never been seen before on the continent. Within a very short time, Germany developed into a leading power whose influence extended far beyond its borders. For the other European states, this meant a challenge. In particular, Great Britain, Russia, and Austria-Hungary had to realign their foreign policy strategies in order to deal with the changed situation. While Britain initially pursued a policy of restraint, other parts of Europe began to develop alliances and counter-strategies to compensate for Germany's growing weight. For France, on the other hand, the consequences of the war were particularly drastic. The military defeat, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, and the payment of high reparations left deep traces in the national self-image. The new Republican administration was faced with the difficult task of stabilizing the country while dealing with the consequences of the war. A central aspect of this was the so-called revenge thinking. Many French people did not regard the Peace of Frankfurt as a final solution, but as a temporary state of affairs that would have to be revised one day. The desire to regain the lost territories and restore national honor became an important political and social motive. This thinking was to shape French foreign policy for decades. The war also had lasting effects within Germany. National unity strengthened the self-confidence of the population and led to a new sense of belonging. At the same time, Prussia's position within the empire was consolidated, as it remained the dominant force. But the new order was not free of tensions. The integration of the various German states into a common political system required adjustments and compromises. Regional identities remained, and not all political forces were satisfied with the structure of the empire. Another important aspect was the increasing militarization of Europe. The success of Prussia and the German Empire was attributed by many observers to the strength of the military. This led to other states also beginning to modernize and expand their armies. Military planning, armament, and strategic considerations gained in importance. This development contributed to an atmosphere of mistrust. States observed each other closely, reacted to military changes, and tried to prepare for possible conflicts. Alliances were formed, plans were developed, and scenarios were played out. Europe was thus gradually moving towards a system in which a major conflict became increasingly likely. Nationalism also played a decisive role. The success of German unification inspired other national movements, for example in Italy or in the multi-ethnic empires of Europe. At the same time, it led to national identity increasingly being linked to political power and military strength. This increased tensions within and between states. In Austria-Hungary, for example, pressure grew from various national groups demanding more autonomy or independence. There were also increasing tensions in the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans, which were partly influenced by developments in Central Europe. The economic consequences of the war were also significant. Germany benefited from French reparation payments and was able to further advance its industrial development. New investments, infrastructure projects, and economic expansion strengthened the position of the empire. France, on the other hand, had to reorganize itself economically. Despite the high burdens, however, the country managed to make the reparation payments relatively quickly and recover economically. This showed the resilience of French society, but did not change the political tensions. Another long-term effect of the war was the change in diplomatic relations. Mistrust and rivalry characterized the interactions between the European powers. In particular, the relationship between Germany and France remained tense and became a central factor in European politics. These tensions contributed to the development of two large alliance systems over time. States sought security through alliances, but this also meant that conflicts could escalate more quickly. A local dispute could now have a greater impact, as it affected several states at the same time. The Franco-German War can therefore be seen as an important step on the road to the First World War. Many of the developments that later led to this global conflict, nationalism, militarization, alliance systems, and political rivalry, were intensified or triggered by the events of 1870 to 71. At the same time, one must not overlook the fact that the war also brought progress. The political unification of Germany created new structures, economic development was promoted, and many regions benefited from integration into larger political entities. But these positive aspects were in tension with the political and military risks. For the people of Europe, this new era meant a mixture of hope and uncertainty. On the one hand, the political reorganization offered new opportunities. On the other hand, the fear of future conflicts grew. The memory of the war remained present and influenced the thoughts and actions of many generations. The consequences of the Franco-German War were thus complex. They affected not only the states directly involved, but the entire continent. The events had triggered a dynamic that reached far beyond the 19th century and formed the basis for the great conflicts of the 20th century. Europe had changed, politically, militarily, and socially. And although the Peace of Frankfurt marked a provisional conclusion, it was clear that history was far from over. Chapter 15: Memory and Significance Today. The Franco-German War of 1870-71 has long been history, and yet it continues to have an impact today. What once began as a military conflict between France and the newly formed German Empire developed into an event with profound historical significance. Its consequences not only shaped European politics for decades, but continue to influence the way history is remembered, interpreted, and understood today. Memory is never static. It changes over time, is reassessed and adapted to current social developments. This is particularly evident in the case of the Franco-German War. In the decades after 1871, memory was strongly influenced by national perspectives. In Germany, the war was long celebrated as a triumphant moment of unification, as the culmination of a historic process that had led to the founding of a nation-state. Monuments, celebrations, and schoolbooks conveyed an image of strength, unity, and success. In France, on the other hand, a completely different image of memory dominated. There, the war was perceived as a painful defeat, a loss of territory and prestige. The cession of Alsace-Lorraine became a symbol of national humiliation, and the desire for revenge remained alive for decades. The memory of the war was closely linked to the feeling that an injustice had been done that would have to be corrected one day. These opposing perspectives contributed to the further aggravation of relations between the two countries. The war was not simply over, it lived on in people's minds. Generations grew up with different interpretations of events, which made mutual understanding difficult. It was only in the course of the 20th century that this image began to change. The experiences of two world wars led to a fundamental rethink. The devastating consequences of these conflicts made clear where nationalist rivalries and unresolved tensions can lead. In this context, the Franco-German War was also reassessed, no longer just as a national victory or defeat, but as part of a development that contributed to major catastrophes in the long term. An important step in this process was the rapprochement between Germany and France after the Second World War. Both countries recognized that a lasting peace order in Europe was only possible through cooperation. The so-called German-French friendship developed into a central element of European integration. This new perspective also influenced the culture of remembrance. Historical events were increasingly viewed from a common European perspective. The Franco-German War was no longer presented as a national conflict, but as part of a complex history that links the two countries. Today, war plays a less central role in the public consciousness than other events, such as the World Wars. Nevertheless, it remains an important point of reference for historians, educators, and those interested in politics. It serves as an example of the dynamics of power politics, the importance of communication, and the long-term consequences of political decisions. In research, the war is viewed in a differentiated way. Historians analyze not only the military events, but also the political, social, and cultural backgrounds. It becomes clear that the conflict was not triggered by a single event, but was the result of a variety of factors, from national ambitions to diplomatic tensions to individual decisions. The role of personalities such as Otto von Bismarck or Napoleon III is also assessed in a more differentiated way today. Instead of portraying them only as heroes or losers, one tries to understand the context in which they acted and what opportunities were available to them. Another important aspect is remembrance in public space. In both countries, there are monuments, museums, and memorials that commemorate the war, but their meaning has changed. Whereas in the past they often served national self-assurance, today the focus is often on aspects such as reconciliation, learning from history, and international cooperation. The war also continues to play a role in education. Pupils not only learn about the events themselves, but also how they are placed in larger historical contexts. This is increasingly about promoting critical thinking and taking different perspectives into account. The significance of the Franco-German War today lies less in its immediate course than in its long-term effects. It shows how quickly political tensions can escalate, how important diplomatic communication is, and what consequences national rivalries can have. At the same time, he reminds us that history is not immutable. The way we understand past events depends on our own time and experiences. What was once taken for granted can be questioned later. What used to divide can now unite. For Europe as a whole, the war is part of a larger historical process. It is one of the events that contributed to the emergence of modern nation-states, but also one of the developments that led to conflicts in the long term. It is in this area of tension that its special significance lies. Today, at a time when the focus is on European cooperation and international understanding, looking at such events can help to better understand the importance of peace and cooperation. The history of the Franco-German War shows how important it is to identify conflicts at an early stage, to engage in dialogue, and to seek joint solutions. In the end, the realization remains that history does not only consist of data and facts, but of experiences that are passed on. The Franco-German War is an example of how a single conflict can have far-reaching consequences, and how important it is to learn from these experiences. This closes the circle. From the first tensions to the outbreak of the war to its long-term effects, we have seen how complex and multi-layered this chapter of history is. And perhaps in the end, there will remain exactly the question with which it all began. Can a single event really be enough to trigger a war, or is it always the many small steps before it that make the decisive difference?